right, Tara, number one. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Okay, awesome. Thank you. 1, 2. Yep. Just a couple seconds to go live on our end.
Okay, we'll make sure that I can,
So like 5 seconds.
sure enough.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Lara Vilomachi and hers. I am the head of Outreach and Community Experience here at the Framingham Public Library. We are so thrilled to have you here tonight for our lifelong learning lecture and very excited to present Dr. Elizabeth Fideler. She will be talking about her new book. I'm going to make sure I get the title right because I apologize. We missed a word in our marketing. So it is Blanche Ames Ames, 2 Ameses, and Oaks Ames, Cultivating That Mutual Ground. The Lifelong Learning Lecture Series is in partnership with the Framingham State University, and our next lecture will be in 2 weeks on Thursday, October 19th. We'll be featuring Dr. P. Bradley Nutting, and he'll be discussing Cotton Mather, a man of 2 worlds. At this time, we'd ask the folks here in the room to go ahead and turn off their cell phones, ringers, alarms, anything like that. Go ahead and turn those off. Folks at home, take this opportunity to snuggle in a little bit, get a little extra comfy, although unfortunately you are missing out on some of our treats in the back. This lecture will be about 45 minutes long, and then afterwards, Dr. Fideler will take the opportunity to answer some questions in the room, or if you'd like to put your questions in the chat on YouTube. For the folks in the room, we do have some evaluation forms in the back. We would love to hear from you what you thought about tonight's event, if you have any ideas for future events, and if you're not already on our mailing list, we'd love to have you join us. We're the library. The only thing we'll ever send you is more information about great free library programs. Thank you so much to our sponsors, the Joseph L. and Ray L. Freund Foundation. Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. Okay.
Freund.
Freund, okay.
Freund.
Courtesy of Elizabeth F. Fideler. And as always, thanks to the Friends of the Framingham Public Library, without whom none of this would be possible. After tonight's lecture, Dr. Fideler will be signing and selling her book for those of you in the room. So if you are interested, she'll have more information in the back. And with that, we would like to welcome Dr. Fideler. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lara. It's great to be back here in the Costin Room, where there have been so many wonderful events, presentations, and the book group that Bob Dodd and Ruth Winnett and Marilyn, I forget Marilyn's last name, and I started, that's like, I don't know, 20 years ago. So we began meeting here a long time ago, and book group's still going. And some of my book group friends are here, and I thank you all for coming. So tonight we're going to be talking about, I should thank Lara also for making the arrangements. Tonight we're going to be talking about someone who has this rather unusual name, and her husband. And I think when the publicity first went out, they dropped one of the Ames because they assumed it was a typo, and it's not. So we're going to talk about not just these people as individuals, but about the partnership, because I got started by just focusing on Blanche, and then I realized that it was a partnership, and I really had to learn more about Oaks, and I'm glad I did. Now, it's a story of mutual enabling, and this is the first half of the 20th century, so you've got to turn your head back to earlier times. And it's a story that deserved to be told. I seem to gravitate towards people who are not famous, but who are not just interesting, but remarkable, and often they're women, and they have stories that just need to be out there. And so I take a little detour from some of my usual work, which is, I was discussing with this person over here about older workers, and do these biographies because I just enjoy them so much. So we're going to talk first about what Blanche and Oaks had in common besides the surname. He was Oaks Ames and she was Blanche Ames, but they were not related. Okay. They were not related. Well, they were married later, but they weren't related originally. Okay, so first we talk about their family lineage. They both had Civil War generals in their families. They had politicians in their families. Each of them had a governor of Massachusetts. Blanche's grandfather was governor of Massachusetts, and Oaks's father was governor of Massachusetts. That's not typical. The men were businessmen, very successful. Both of them came from families where the women were very strong-minded. That was a big influence. This was especially true of Blanche's mother, who made sure that Blanche and all her sisters, there were 6 children, they all went to college. Now remember when this was. This was not even 20th century, this was 19th century. Now, Blanche and Oaks married in 1900, and they had 4 children, Pauline, Oliver, Amyas, and Evelyn. And there were 15 grandchildren. George Ames Plimpton was number 1, and that may ring a bell for some of you. He was, seeing some nodding heads, he was the editor of the Paris Review, and he was the guy who conducted the New York Philharmonic once and then wrote a book about it, or played football on a big professional team and wrote a book about it. He was a dilettante, but he was very talented and probably the favorite grandchild of all the 15. They had wealth in common, Blanche and Oakes. There was a succession of Oakes and Olivers. You know, people just kept the family names going. So it's a little bit confusing. I want to stop a minute and just point out that the cover of this book was designed by a woman, the artist, who really got it, because this is orchids. Okay, as you can see here. And among the Oakes and the Olivers, there was old Oliver. He came over from England, and he started an iron works. That became the Ames Shovel Company. And you may not think that shovels are so sexy, but remember that there was a gold rush, and you needed a shovel. And there was a civil war, you needed a shovel. There was a transcontinental railroad being built. You get the picture. And Oliver and his brother Oakes were invited by Abraham Lincoln to be the directors of the Transcontinental Railroad. So you're beginning to get a picture. There was a certain amount of scandal around that, but we don't have time to go into all the details of that. Now, Blanche's grandfather was Benjamin Franklin Butler, and he was a Civil War general. And just to give you an idea of the prominence and the wealth in this family, this is on Blanche's side. The Ames Shovel Company was on Oakes' side. On Benjamin Franklin Butler owned U.S. Cartridge Company, as in bullets, wars, bullets, very profitable. An electric company, a textile mill. He owned a good mile of the Cape Ann waterfront shore, where he began building residences for this extended family over about a mile of the Cape Ann shore. And he owned western ranch lands in Colorado and New Mexico that were all left in trust to this very extended family. What really attracted me to Blanche and Oakes, though, was their lifelong interest in the arts, science, nature, and sports. And then we're going to talk about their commitment to social justice and Borderland. We're going to get to all of those. And now I've told you all these things that they had in common, but they couldn't have been more different as personalities. She was sociable, lively, strong-minded, very independent. She saw herself, as women did in the early 20th century, as a new woman. And she loved to compete, whether it was on the tennis court or the golf course. She loved an argument. She was described by her grandchildren, and all the grandchildren I was able to interview were all in their 80s to 90s. So when I say grandchildren, I'm talking about older folks. They remember her still as very kind, but a disciplinarian and not cozy or cuddly. Who's doing the slides? Okay, can you go to the slide of Blanche? This is a Tarbell portrait, 1907. Do you know who Tarbell was? Okay, he was the director of the School of Fine Arts, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. His name was Edmund Tarbell, and his dates are 1862 to 1938. And he did this portrait. Oakes commissioned the portrait. She sat like 27 times she had to pose. That's her wedding dress, and this is 6 years after they were married. And it's rather lovely, and he was, of course, a very famous artist, so that was a big deal. Can we go to the next slide? This is Blanche at Smith College on the basketball team. I think she's fourth from the left. And that picture is at Borderland in a very prominent location because that meant a lot to her. That's, again, that idea about the competition. She was also on the debate team at Smith College. And I thought it was kind of clever of the faculty member who assigned the topics. He gave her a topic that was the opposite of her own position. Betsy's nodding her head because she read that in the book. But that was good for Blanche. She needed to be challenged that way. Okay, what do we know about Oakes? Let's go to the next one. Here, you see how aristocratic he looks. He was a Harvard grad. He became a professor of botany at Harvard for 50 years. And he was tapped to be the administrator of all of their botanical institutions, which was a big headache for someone who really just wanted to study orchids. He really did. That's really what he loved. He was quiet. He was shy, very reserved. He was also moody and aloof. He could be called cold and distant. And the grandchildren were scared of him, except for one or two who had an interest in science, and he would talk to them a lot. One of the unusual things about Oakes was that he was a chronicler. Blanche didn't write all that well, but he kept a daily diary for 50 years. And if you want to follow up on this book, his book is in the library collection, and it's called Jottings of a Harvard Botanist. Now, that was drawn by Pauline, the eldest child, from his diaries, which are many. And she selected excerpts to put into this Jottings of a Harvard Botanist, which was a great resource for me as I was uncovering the story. So Pauline wrote an introduction and included some very interesting reading in the Jottings. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is going to be about Borderland. Blanche and Oakes were married in 1900, as I mentioned, and for 6 years she lived with her mother-in-law. They lived with Oakes's mother, who had become a widow. Now, she was the governor's wife, and then he died, and she was a widow. And Oakes was her youngest of 6. So they both came from families of 6 children. And Oakes was perfectly happy living with his mama. And that's how she wanted it. Meanwhile, Blanche had 2 children at that point. They ended up having 4 altogether. And finally, Blanche kind of put her foot down and said, we need to have our own place. That was a really tough time. They almost broke up the marriage over all of that. They moved to what became Borderland. It's now 1,800 acres with 6 ponds and lakes. You can go and leave Framingham and be there in about 35 or 40 minutes. It's in northeastern Massachusetts. And you can see the surrounding towns. So it's near Sharon and Stoughton and Brockton, et cetera. If you know Stonehill College, that's in the vicinity. Stonehill College was the estate of Oakes's cousin. And the family, all those Ames folks lived around Easton and in that territory. Borderland was the property that very quietly Blanche and Oakes started to buy, because if anyone knew that they were the Ames Shovel Company people, the price would have gone up. So they acquired a lot of property, and it took some years, and they had an architect who designed something that was so opulent that it was totally the wrong design, and Blanche and Oakes, but Blanche mainly, dumped him. And he was pretty upset about that. And she took over because she had no engineering training, but she knew how to do engineering stuff. So, are any of you familiar with Borderland? Have you ever been there? Or Betsy knows about it. Okay. So it's really worth a day trip. Take your lunch, walk. You can walk and walk and walk. You couldn't possibly do it all in one day. It's a state park for the Commonwealth. It's about 4 miles outside of town. And there are different interpretations of the name. Why Borderland? What does that mean? Yeah, it could have been that they named it that because it was on the hunting and fishing grounds of indigenous people, spanning different, before these towns were named, of course, going way back. It was also outside the socially accepted bounds of society, right? As we're going to talk about their social justice commitments, they were into issues and movements that the rest of the Ameses were not. Also, you could think of the borderland as meaning that they were crossing some of what we called the traditional gender roles of the time, when women were responsible for the domestic sphere, the private, the household, the children, and men could be public. Women weren't supposed to be giving speeches or being out in public. And Blanche and Oakes, he was totally with her on that. They didn't believe in that, but the rest of the family did. So let's go to the next slide. This is Borderland. The mansion is all concrete. They were afraid of fire. And one whole wing of Borderland is Oakes's library. It's worth going just to see that. It's 2 stories high. It has a balcony running around the middle. There were more than 10,000 books in his collection, much of it having to do with nature, science, orchids, everything he was particularly interested in, but also art, because Blanche had a degree from Smith in art. She was a painter. She painted the portrait of Oakes that we showed. She painted a lot of oil painting portraits. She talked to Edmund Tarbell about painting oil paintings. And then she illustrated all of Oakes's books about orchids, and there were 7 volumes. She traveled with him to all the places. Remember, this was before they went by ship. They didn't have airplane travel early on. And they had children. They left home with the servants, and they traveled, and they didn't have cell phones. So if you got bitten by an insect or a snake and you were in the Yucatan in the middle of the jungle looking for orchids, that was dangerous. But they were intrepid. They did that repeatedly. Let's go to the next picture. This is from the museum that's at Easton. It used to be the railroad station, and they have like Framingham has our historical society. They have the same idea, and it's all about the Ames shovel works and everything about that era. So it's a fun place to visit. And the railroad station is one of the ones designed by H.H. Richardson. So if you're familiar with, like in Wellesley Hills, there were 30 some of them around Boston. And H.H. Richardson worked with Frederick Law Olmsted, who did all the landscaping. So they were kind of a team. Frederick Law Olmsted was responsible for what became the Arnold Arboretum. I'm sure some of you have visited the Arnold Arboretum in Jamaica Plain. Well, that was one of the Harvard botanical institutions that Oakes was responsible for. So all these connections are important. So if we go to the next picture, I think this tells you so much about everything we've said so far. Their love of the outdoors, their partnership, and they often had 8 servants in the house and maybe 8 or 10 servants on the ground. Yeah, that's a lot of property to maintain. And but they were out there sawing wood. So I think that tells you a lot. Let's go to the next picture. That's a glimpse of the library today. I took that one. And you can see that there's that balcony, and it's a glass floor. It's a little scary to walk on a glass floor. Yeah, it makes you a little bit nervous. But almost everything is as it was. There were films made there. Did anyone ever see the film Daniel Craig, Knives Out. It was not a great film, but it was filmed in that library and in that house at Borderland. Yeah, it's a period piece. And you can get a tour of the house if you make arrangements. Okay, one more about the library. This dragon, which they brought home from one of their trips, obviously, used to have ruby eyes, but they were stolen because the dragon was out by the pool outside the mansion. Blanche realized that there was a spring, a natural spring, and because of her inventiveness and engineering know-how, she turned it into a swimming pool, spring-fed swimming pool, and the dragon was there outside. So somebody came and stole the ruby eyes, but they moved it into the library. Borderland is a state park now because the family essentially almost handed it to the state, to the Commonwealth. It became a gift to the mansion, and all the artwork and the silver and anything you can think of, furniture, was all given gratis to the people of Massachusetts. I think they got maybe $1 million for all that acreage. If you do the math, you realize they kind of gave it away. Okay, now let's talk about some of the collaboration. Orchids. These are drawings by Blanche, just a tiny sample. The travel I already talked about, and one of the other institutions that Oakes was responsible for was where you would find the glass flowers in the Peabody Museum in Cambridge. I'm sure you've been there or taken your kids there. Everybody wants to see the glass flowers. That was another one of his responsibilities. The orchids were drawn by Blanche. We'll go to the next slide and you'll see more of the same. And the next slide, Oakes at his microscope. She used something called a camera lucida to magnify the specimens that she was looking at, and then she could do her drawings from that. When Oakes was wooing her, when she was a college senior, now that's 1899, and her brother and Oakes knew each other. So the brother was going to visit his sister and brought Oakes along, probably had some ideas going. And Oakes very quickly wanted to be engaged, they proposed. And as a present, think of all the things that somebody might want to give to the fiancé. He gave her art books and slides and a microscope. He was already thinking ahead. And that worked. That worked. Now let's get to the next. That's the camera lucida. All of this is at Borderland. You can see all of these artifacts. And then we'll go to the next. This is suffrage. Now, Blanche wasn't the first to get into suffrage. In fact, the whole rest of the Ames family was anti-suffrage. And I don't know if you knew this, but it kind of shocked me. Massachusetts was the most anti-suffrage state in America. Yeah. Doesn't bode well. So for Blanche and Oakes, who was as equally committed as she was, to become suffragists and participate in parades and rallies and all of that, was going against everybody else in the family. In fact, one of Oakes's cousins was a Mrs. Frothingham, and she was not only active locally, regionally, but nationally, fighting against the idea of women getting the vote. And you know enough, all of you, about suffrage that I don't have to explain all of that to you. Blanche, being an artist, did political cartooning. And this is one of several that are absolutely wonderful. They wanted to get across the idea, you know how people come up with something called fake news and disinformation, whatever? Well, in those days, it was said that if a woman got the vote, it was going to wreck the home and the family. And, you can embroider anything you want out of that. So this was to show the loving mother with the children, etc. Double the power of the vote. 2 good votes are better than 1. The Woman's Journal and Suffrage News published many of her political cartoons. Do you know the name Lucy Stone? Does that mean anything? She was a very early woman who went to Oberlin, which is very unusual for a woman to go to college. She was a whole other generation before Blanche, way back at the time of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and so on, Lucretia Mott. And when Lucy Stone was number 1 in her class and was invited to write the commencement speech, she could write it, but she couldn't deliver it. Women weren't allowed to give a public address. A man had to read it. So Lucy Stone got started with this journal, and her daughter Alice Stone Blackwell became the editor after her mother. If we go to the next cartoon, next we'll see the next cartoon, the map blossoms. This is showing you the western states often allowed women to vote in at least school board elections or just local elections, but they still didn't have the vote for Congress or president or anything like that. Let's go to the next. That was 1915. 2 pedestals. This is showing ignorance and idleness and irresponsibility and inferiority on one side, and then all these wonderful motherhood, sisterhood, cooperation, service, companionship and love, education and religion. Boy, she was socking it to you, but getting the message across. Let's go to the next one. Now, when I mentioned that Blanche and Oakes traveled all over the place to look for orchids, one of the places he went with, I think she may have gone at least once, but he went repeatedly, was Cuba. There was a sugar plantation, the Atkins Sugar Plantation. It became a research center. Harvard took it over eventually. He brought that bell home. It's probably a slave bell that called the slaves to work on the plantation. Not such a great association, but he brought that bell home. They put it on top of Borderland, and it could be used to ring to tell the children and the grandchildren it was time for lunch or it was time for dinner, because they'd be out all over the place. There's a lot of property for them to wander. They could roam freely. But it was also used when women were struggling to get the vote, and there were various congressmen who were blocking that. When she succeeded in a campaign to get somebody to replace one of the Massachusetts senators who was blocking suffrage, she vowed to ring the bell. The bell was very symbolic. Let's move on to another area of social justice. She was corresponding with Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was sticking her neck out to get women to have reproductive rights. She did not go into abortion, which we are talking about today, but it was all about contraception. And because the church was so strong in Massachusetts, again, Massachusetts was one of the states that was preventing not only the purchase of contraception, but you couldn't even send information about it through the mail. There were the Comstock laws that had been put in place years before that said that just made it illegal to even talk about, to explain, to instruct or educate anyone about contraception, let alone to make it available to people. So Margaret Sanger was asking for Blanche's help. She picked a good person for that, and Blanche really got into it. And she was the co-founder of the Birth Control League of Massachusetts and stayed with that for 20 years. It wasn't until 1966 that married women were allowed to have, all of that was erased. And Blanche died in 1969, so she lived long enough to see that it finally happened. But remember, she was in 1916 is when they founded the Birth Control League of Massachusetts. That was a long struggle. Court cases. The doctors who tried to talk about contraception were arrested and had to go to court and were fined and found guilty. It was a really difficult, and the Birth Control League of Massachusetts, in its many iterations, became Planned Parenthood. That's where Planned Parenthood came from. And all that suffrage movement, that's where the League of Women Voters came from. Those were the predecessors. It's kind of fascinating. So let's go on to some of the legacy. Borderland State Park, and this is something you will see if you go to visit, if you're in the mansion. Blanche's sewing machine is there, and then that spool of thread gave her an idea. Being an inventor, and it was World War II, she thought those airplanes that were dropping bombs in the Blitz, if you could snare the propeller, you could bring down the plane. And she got her son was a flyer, he was a Navy officer. And she figured out and did the design of an invention that the Pentagon approved of, except it was so close to the end of the war they never ended up using it. But she invented this way of heavy threads snaring an airplane. I think we have one slide if we go to the next one. There it is. And she worked very hard on that, and she had her son take his plane up to demonstrate it to the gentleman from the Pentagon who came and approved it. The next slide is Blanche's father, Adelbert Ames. He was another Civil War general. He was senator. He was brought into Mississippi as the governor during Reconstruction. And if you know anything about Reconstruction, in Mississippi, they were ready to hang him. They gave him a terrible time. It was so dangerous that his wife, and Blanche's mother was Blanche. Blanche's mother, Blanche, and the children didn't go very often to visit him because it was just too dangerous to be there. And he was accused of a lot of things that he wasn't guilty of, but they railroaded him essentially out of that job. But he was a senator and a governor. And when John F. Kennedy wrote Profiles in Courage, well, we don't know that he actually wrote it. Somebody else may have written it. But anyway, when Profiles in Courage was written, we'll put it in that tone, they complimented one of the subjects in Profiles in Courage and vilified her father. And Blanche was so indignant that she had her grandson, George Ames Plimpton, was a friend of JFK. So he could go and talk to JFK and plead to, when you reprint the book, you should tell the story about her father because he was a hero, not a scoundrel. And JFK didn't do it. So Blanche took it on herself to write a 600 and something page book about her father. And she was that wasn't published till she was in her 80s. This is Blanche. So one more. At the Arnold Arboretum, Oakes hired a fellow who was a scientist who planted a lot of trees that have grown up to be a crabapple tree like this one that's named for Blanche. And it's a lovely specimen, and she didn't live a long enough life to see that, but I thought that she would be especially pleased to know that the new elementary school in Easton, Massachusetts, that was just completed in January, is the Blanche Ames Ames Elementary School, the first school named for a woman, and it replaced 3 very old little elementary schools. It's a huge, huge building. And Betsy, have you gotten to the end of the book yet? No, I didn't. Okay, well, I don't want to Well, I just wanted to share a little something. I mentioned Mrs. Frothingham earlier, and she was anti-suffrage and influenced the family and many other people. Well, when the school committee and the building committee for this new elementary school they were trying to decide who should it be named for. So they had kind of a contest. Mrs. Frothingham was one of the names that was put forward, but she didn't get it. Blanche got it. I thought that was delicious. So, I would encourage you to take a look if you want to follow up and read Jottings of a Harvard Botanist, or read in it, because it's really quite good. And if you're interested in this, we'll be happy to sell you a copy in the back. And I'll take questions. I think that's about the time for questions. Yeah. Are there any questions? Trudy?
And if you just repeat the question, you can answer it.
Did you have a question?
Oh,
Yeah.
do you know when this picture was taken about?
This is probably within the last year or two. The director of the Arnold Arboretum took the picture, and he's Ned Friedman. Yeah, and I got permission to use it. Have to check everything. Betsy?
For Blanche Ames, how did you pick her? How did that come about?
In some years ago, like, oh, I'm sorry. How did it come? I forgot. How did I come to this subject of Blanche in particular? Margaret Pearmain Welch is the subject of the first biography I wrote, and that came out in about 2017, I think. Margaret lived down the street from us in Framingham. That was her country house. She lived at Lewisburg Square in the winter. And I had been reading biographies by women and about women, and I began to pick up the theme of all these people who weren't Amelia Earhart, and they weren't Eleanor Roosevelt, for whom there are wonderful biographies, but there are all these other interesting people whose stories deserve to be told. Who did I think of? Margaret. So I wrote that biography, and I discovered when 1916, the founding of the Birth Control League of Massachusetts, this person named Blanche Ames Ames was the co-founder with Margaret. And I thought, who has a name like that? And I just sort of tucked it away in back of my mind, and then when I was ready to write another biography, I said, I have to find out who she was. That's all I knew, is that she was the co-founder with Margaret, but Margaret was my subject. So I began to look into Blanche. And then one thing led to another, and I was actually working on something about older workers, and I came across somebody named Olivia Ames Hoplitzel. And I said, I wonder if she's an Ames. And I was able to track her down, and sure enough, she's one of the grandchildren. And she's written books about aging with wisdom and whatever, a lovely woman. And she connected me to all the other grandchildren. So it just opened up all the doors. And it's a remarkable family in many, many ways. So that's how I got to Blanche. It was really through Margaret originally. Yes?
Along those lines, when did you start writing? Have you been writing books for a long, long time, or did you start writing books?
Well, I started with, as I told you earlier, I started being interested in women especially who were staying in the workforce 60s, 70s, 80s, and then after I retired, yeah. Yeah, and I had done a lot of education research, so I knew how to be a researcher, but I started writing. I wrote these books about aging and work and retirement and whatever, but in between I just got into this biography area, and yeah, I've been doing it ever since. Yeah, I really enjoy it. Yeah. Ruth, hello.
Fascinating. Hi. This is a really interesting overview of a couple in your book. I have some questions about Oates. How did he manage to have a busy career at Harvard when he lived so far away? And
Oh, well,
really was not.
I didn't bring a picture of, they had, I'm sorry. Thank you, Lara. The question was, it's about Oakes, and how did he manage to be so busy with his teaching and his administrative responsibilities and living at Borderland? But they didn't spend all their time at Borderland. In Boston, you could visit the mansions that they lived in. His father, the governor, had an enormous mansion in Boston that Oakes bought from his father for something like $90,000. Today, I can't even tell you how many millions. And in the winter, they would be in Boston. They also owned property in Florida, and they were across the street from Rockefeller, with whom her father played golf, in Ormond Beach in Florida. So they traveled, and yes, what, Paul? Oh, yeah, I was just saying that yeah, but it was also train travel. He could get from Brockton or from the Ames Shovel Company brought the Old Colony Railroad right into Easton because they needed to be able to ship the shovels, and that made a big difference to have the railroad there for not only the shipping but also for commuting. So it worked. Trudy, did you have a question?
I just was reflecting on the try of the museums say that you can go to Borderland and you have to know when it's open, they have certain hours, days of the week. It's still 1,800 acres there.
Mm-hmm.
The state of Massachusetts didn't try to develop it.
No, it's a state park. So it's just open land and with wonderful people walk and ride bikes and, skateboard and travel all around there. It's a wonderful, we've been there several times and the parking lot is just full of people. And it doesn't.
Dogs love the place. Dogs.
Oh, people walking their dogs, exactly. Yeah.
Well, it just surprises me because you know what happened to Walden. So I'm thinking that maybe some developers would have wanted to have a chunk of the 1,800 acres. But that's good.
Yeah, it's all there. Yes, Joel.
This book is about two people, basically, but you dug into the family, and it sounds like their children and grandchildren and other members of the family are interested. Have you thought about putting together their family tree and talking about other members of the family?
Well, there is a kind of a family tree in here. And there's a pretty good chapter that gives you the question was, what about the rest of the family on both sides? And there's a pretty good chapter that talks about what you're asking about in the book. Family background is. His father was Oliver, yes, and he was governor of Massachusetts. And Blanche's grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Butler, was governor of Massachusetts. And they lived well. They lived very well. Betsy?
Question, do you think she could have done as much as she did without all the wealth and the power? She had a lot of wealth behind her, a lot of power, she had a lot of influence. I'm just wondering if somebody without all that behind them could have done as much as she did.
I think the question was, could they have accomplished as much as they did if they didn't have the wealth and the prominence and all that? I think we have to acknowledge that what they had, all the benefits that they had, but they put it to good use. And that's really where the story is. Sure, they were not Abe Lincoln in the log cabin, that whole, that's not the saga that we're talking about. But I think we should applaud them because they used what they had for the benefit of for the greater good, which I think was pretty noble of them. Yeah. Trudy, another question?
Oh, I was just saying, they just had the ability to accomplish all that they accomplished. And, raising a family in those days, they didn't have the, what mothers and fathers have and appliances and everything. That they were able to accomplish so much. That's what's amazing.
Trudy's commenting that it was amazing that they were able to do so much, accomplish so much in a time when we didn't have the modern conveniences. They were the first property they had electricity throughout the mansion. They had early cars. They were able to, whatever was available, they could have. Yeah, yeah.
I'm going to cheat and use my microphone. Was there a fact that you found out about them that you wished you could have included in the book or the presentation, and it didn't make sense with the structure, but that is just one of those facts that was your favorite that kind of stuck in your head?
I think I got everything in that I wanted to, that I thought was most relevant to put across the enabling, the mutual enabling, and it wasn't easy every day. Believe me, he was reserved and moody, and she kind of propped him up, I think, and kept him going. But he backed what she wanted to do. So their teamwork was really what worked. I only found out about the new school belatedly, and so there's an epilogue to the book that I was able to get in at the last minute, because I thought that would have been a very special pleasure for her. There's a place in Boston, in Roxbury, called the Dimmock Center, and there's a whole chapter in the book that I didn't talk about tonight, where she was essentially the chair of the board of the Dimmock, what became the Dimmock Center, but before that it was the New England Hospital for Women and Children, staffed only by women and for women and children. And there were a lot of battles fought over that. There was another whole chapter in the book that one of the grandchildren helped me with, because there was a huge lawsuit against the Arnold Arboretum and Harvard University because of all the things that Oaks had donated. Harvard was taking back to Cambridge, and she fought a huge battle around that. So I think I got into a lot of the areas where she was a fighter, and she didn't always win, but she was a damn good fighter. And Ruth.
It strikes me that what's so remarkable is when you think about other women of her era and her class and what they were probably doing, which was debutante balls and tea and etc.
Ruth is pointing out that women of her class and her time and so on they were very restricted in many ways from, even if they did go to college, they often couldn't make use of their college education. Out of that, it's in my first biography about Margaret Pearmain Welch, out of that came the AAUW, American Association of University Women, because some of the president of Wellesley, of Mount Holyoke, what we call the Seven Sisters, they got together. They were educating women who were very talented and bright, and there was nowhere for them to go. They couldn't have careers because they were of a social class where that wasn't acceptable. So this is an era when the new woman was talked about, but can you imagine the arguments at home over that? How difficult that must have been. Well, I've enjoyed talking about Blanche and Oaks. I hope you have enjoyed it too. And I appreciate you coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fideler, for sharing Blanche and Oak's story tonight. Thank you all in the room for joining us. Thank you for joining us at home. We hope you'll join us for our next lecture, which again is on October 19th at 7 p.m., featuring Dr. P. Bradley Nutting, Cotton Mather, A Man of Two Worlds, 7 p.m. Don't forget, if you come in person, we do have cookies and coffee for you. And of course, it's always online. Tonight's lecture, if you weren't able to make it, or if you have someone who you know who would have liked to have been here, it will be uploaded onto the Framingham Library YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it after the fact too. So we hope you'll stop by and see it there as well. And thank you again to Dr. Fideler.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.